Thanks very much, Sharon. I'll be pretty brief. I know that I'm between you and the coffee break, and we are running a little bit short on time. Fortunately, in terms of time, when I was asked to come here, I thought I might look again at the topic which I spoke on when I was here 2 years ago, which was the Irish National Climate Change Strategy. We just had a new strategy announced in the weeks before I spoke. And I thought it'd be interesting to revisit that and update and see what new legislation emerged out of it. In short, not an awful lot has happened since then, so my paper is really just an update. The paper that I gave 2 years ago has since been published and is still available on the UCC website, I think, so you can refer to that if you want to, and you also have a copy of my paper in your materials today. So really what I'm going to do very, very rapidly is just skip through the slides that I prepared and highlight what I think are the most important aspects of those, and really focus on the main thing that I wanted to do was just to point to some other things we could be doing, because as Conor has said, climate change is a very, very major issue, and in a lot of ways I think we're not doing enough about it. I was unhappy to discover that there wasn't that much more to say about Irish climate change law when I was researching, for two reasons. One was that it left me wondering what exactly I was going to say, but also, this is a serious issue and we need to be taking steps to deal with it. And I don't need to talk about what climate change is and the impacts it might have here. I think most people are familiar with the international responses to climate change. We have the Framework Convention, which really is an aspirational treaty, and then the Kyoto Protocol, which has somewhat stronger commitments, but has met with a lot of resistance, particularly from the former US administration and from the former Australian administration. And both of those countries, their attitudes have changed. And we'll wait to see what results from that. There have been, I should say, I suppose, I'm just going to talk briefly about the international context and the European context, and then focus on Ireland, but we just need to get a grasp of the overall context. There have been a number of meetings of the parties to the Framework Convention, Kyoto Protocol, over the years. If you look at the slides there, there's sort of a rhythm to them. Every second year is a good year. The last meeting, which was in Poznan in Poland last year, was not a particularly good year. There is a meeting in Copenhagen in December of this year, and it's one I think we should watch carefully. There is, on the one hand, a lot of optimism because the US administration, the new US administration, has indicated that it is much more willing to take part in this whole process. On the other hand, there is an economic downturn which is causing people to really look much more closely at their bank balances rather than at environmental protection. And when you get down to the nuts and bolts, there's a brief summary of all of this in the paper, which I'll refer you to. But when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, there are a huge amount of very complicated, interconnected issues in terms of the international negotiations, and whether or not it's going to be possible to resolve those between now and December, I really wouldn't hazard a guess. But if there isn't significant movement at the end of the year, then we're going to find it very difficult to find or to put in place a replacement for Kyoto by 2012, when that commitment period will actually expire. Kyoto itself, basically, as you know, requires countries generally to reduce their emissions by at least 5% below their 1990 levels, and then it has a number of additional mechanisms to allow people to offset their emissions. There's a cap and trade system, and then there are either joint implementation or clean development mechanism, joint projects either with developed countries in developed countries or developed countries in developing countries, intended at transfer of capital and of expertise. In the European context, we have an overall bubble for emissions, so the overall target for Europe is a reduction of 8%, but we were allowed an increase of 13% because in 1990 our economic development was not all that high. We have the EU ETS, which Conor's already talked about, so I won't go into that in any detail, and then the 2020, which Conor also touched on. Let me skip over that. Various other European legislation, again, I'm just going to skim through this very quickly. It's set out in a little bit more detail in my paper, although each of these are complicated areas in themselves. Various things to do with emissions from cars and renewable energy sources and so on. The energy performance of building, I'll come back to all of these. Some of these have seen Irish legislation. Here in Ireland, we've had what I would say to be 3 phases in terms of the implementation of climate change strategy here. We had a climate change strategy launched in 2000 by Minister Dempsey. He made it clear at the time that business as usual was not an option. There were quite a number of initiatives mentioned in the National Climate Change Strategy at the time. In terms of how many of those were actually implemented, well, we got excise relief on biofuels. We did get domestic emissions trading linked to the ETS. We did abandon the idea of carbon tax, as Conor mentioned. Money Point is still open. And in general, it seemed that we were actually quietly going back to business as usual. These are the figures taken from the EPA's reports. You'll find them on the EPA's website of our emissions increases over the years. These figures change every year. If you go through the reports, you'll see that every year they re-estimate the figures for previous years. But these are the best figures that I've been able to find. Remember that our target is an increase of 13% over 1990 levels. So it's clear that we've quite a long way to go in terms of actually reaching that. Now, in the last few months, there's been a lot of talk about how the economic downturn may actually bring us to 13%, whether we want to or not. It's very hard to say that whether or not that's true. I think I'm not an expert on that particular idea of estimating and calculating our carbon emissions. Clearly, it will have I don't know if you can use the word positive effect, talking about an economic downturn, but it will have an impact in terms of bringing us closer to our targets. But all of the scenarios are really just estimates, and they're revised time and time again. The more fundamental issue, I think, is that meeting our Kyoto Protocol targets is really just a first step along our longer road. And there are other issues like peak oil and the need to shift to renewable energy in general that we need to be quite cognizant of as well. We have a new National Climate Change Strategy came out in 2007. It contained a number of different policies which affected different sectors. I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but you'll see a lot of them rely on the emissions trading scheme. A lot of them rely on cap reform. And a lot of the items here, they're spelt out in a bit more detail in the paper and in my previous paper as well. A lot of the measures that are listed there actually lead to a very small decrease in emissions. It's ironic that a lot of the fuss in the media of the past year was about the proposal by the Minister to ban incandescent light bulbs, which is actually going to lead to a very negligible reduction in emissions. But I guess because that was something that was going to impact on everybody on a day-to-day basis, it captured headlines much more quickly than something like the Voluntary Large Industry Energy Network, which really isn't going to leap out of the newspaper in the same way. Number of other measures. I suppose the main thing to highlight there is that the implementation status reports has now been replaced by carbon budgets, which are presented by the Minister for the Environment as part of the budgets, which are basically just a report and an update on what has been going on. Legislation, let me skip over all of this just because of lack of time. All of this is covered in the paper, and a lot of this feeds out of the things that Conor was mentioning earlier. The main thing to mention since the last time I was here is that there are now planning exemptions for the installation of renewable energy technologies, things like wind turbines, either for domestic use or in certain industrial or educational institutions as well. So again, you'll find a little bit more detail about those in the paper. What I wanted to do then briefly, just to wrap up, is just to throw out a few things that I've come across as I've been researching and thinking about this area in terms of things that we might do, given that we're not really doing enough. Some future policies we might consider. We might look at the idea of binding national targets for carbon emissions. The Scottish Parliament is currently considering a bill which will impose obligations to reduce carbon emissions on the Scottish ministers. Whether or not that will pass, I don't know. We've had similar legislation proposed here. It has never got through the Oireachtas. I doubt that it will, but it'd be interesting to see how the Scots get on with it. We could think about including agriculture in emissions trading. That's something that's probably not going to be particularly popular. New Zealand launched a very ambitious climate change policy and included agriculture, or was going to include agriculture in its emissions trading scheme from 2013. Now, New Zealand has had a change of government and they may have a change of heart about all of that. I know the New Zealand farmers are no more keen on the idea of a cow tax or anything like that than Irish farmers are. The New Zealanders, being direct, actually gave it another label which I won't use right now. But we could think about actually basically allowing agriculture to reduce emissions and then sell the resulting carbon emission reductions into the ETS market as offsets. This would basically be a form of subsidy, but at least it would get agriculture to start working on reducing its carbon emissions, which might have some positive impacts. At the local authority level, there's a couple of things we might think about. We might look at exceeding the building regulations in particular localities. The US have done quite a lot of work on this. There's the green building energy rating system that they use there. Here, we have already seen some local authorities doing that. Fingal County Council has actually required energy performance in excess of the building regulations in some of its local area plans. In general, local authorities need to think about strategies that they might introduce. There is a report on how this might work in the Northern Irish and Scottish context put together by the Scotland and Northern Ireland Forum for Environmental Research. And I know that here domestically, excuse me, the Department of the Environment is working with local authorities to put together strategies. A lot of those strategies don't actually have legal or regulatory implications, but it's still something that needs to be thought about. Travel planning and congestion charges is something that we should be thinking about. Now, that's a whole large issue. We've just heard about how difficult that can be in the UK. Whether or not it's possible given the legislative framework and whether or not it would be politically palatable is a question that I really couldn't speculate on. I'd say it would be difficult to introduce, but it's nonetheless something that we should think about. We need to think about carbon taxes. The Commission on Taxation is due to report soon and may actually recommend carbon taxes. Friends of the Earth Ireland have put forward an interesting proposal that stamp duty should actually be linked to the building energy rating of houses. I don't know if there's much appetite for tinkering with the stamp duty regime in the current economic climate, but it's an interesting idea. We have the idea of regulatory impact assessment being used across the civil service. It might be interesting for regulators to think also about carbon impact assessments. And there has been some work done again by the Scotland and Northern Ireland Forum for Environmental Research on that in the context of those jurisdictions. So there's some groundwork there already. In the context of the reform of company law that might arise out of the company law review group, we might think about actually requiring companies to put together not just a financial audit, but also some sort of carbon or ecological audit, if just as a tool to get them to actually think about the carbon emission consequences of what they do. I think a lot of these things are about just getting people to actually realize that by making very small adjustments to their behavior, they could have quite a significant impact in terms of the environmental consequences of what they do. And I suppose fundamentally, just to conclude, I think that would be the main point that I would make, that at the end of the day, law is only going to be an element in the overall climate change, carbon reduction, greenhouse gas reduction strategy that we take. As other speakers before have mentioned, this is an issue that's actually very difficult to regulate because it is about gases that arise as a byproduct of industrial activity, agricultural activity is something. All of us are emitting carbon dioxide even as we sit here. And it's very hard to actually regulate that, at least with our traditional tools. At the end of the day, I think in order to deal with climate change, we need to change people's behaviours and change people's attitudes. And law is a very limited tool in terms of doing that. So we're only an element in the overall policy mix that should be our overall strategy. I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much.